Have you heard the news? The North American Debate Circuit is hosting monthly online tournaments with the chance to win cash. Join us this February 11th with entry fees set at an affordable rate to spread debate. Hey, that rhymed.
Eugene and I affirm, we observe that America will always remain involved in West Asia. Branch 19 finds that calls for the United States to disengage are common, yet interests in the regions have not yet disappeared. If the U.S. rushes for the exit, it might find that it's pulled back under worse circumstances. International terrorism and the interest in promoting human rights exert a strong pull on American policy, making it impossible for officials to ignore the region. Thus, the choice isn't between American diplomacy or disengagement, rather diplomacy or violent force. Lindsay 20 finds that in the Middle East, it's time to try diplomacy to fill a void that is often filled by military power. We must learn from our mistakes. MN 16 finds that deaths from Western interventions might be as high as 8 million. Thus, our sole contention is regional stability. Subpoint A is Cyprus. Chan 16 finds that Cyprus has kept its Greek and Turkish communities separate since 1974. However, due to recent government policies, Noid 22 finds that tensions are soon to spiral out of control. Affirming Souls, Gorin 20 finds that the U.S. should invest in efforts to reduce the trust gap between Greek and Turkish Cypriots. Policies including assistance to committees led by representatives from the two communities and funding for programs promoting cooperation and confidence building. Absent diplomacy, escalation would be devastating. Barber 97 finds that Greek and Turkish forces swing into action. Fighting will spread to the disputed Asian islands. Subpoint B is Iran. Current protests will erupt into civil war unless America diplomatically engages. Ruben 22 finds that it is clear the Republic will not go down without a fight. Just like how 11 years ago, Assad kidnapped al-Khatib and civil war soon engulfed Syria. Iran will be no different. During the Obama administration, Assad enjoyed support, while progressive Syrians had nobody. They radicalized out of disillusionment. Today, Biden repeats Obama's mistakes. Time is running out to prevent Syria 2.0. History must not repeat itself. France 21 finds that a decade of war in Syria has left nearly 500,000 people dead. Our final subpoint is Turkey. Erdogan is escalating tensions in Syria. Jeffrey 22 finds that Turkish threats to launch ground operations into Syria against the Kurdistan Workers' Party has again raised tensions. The cause of the current crisis was 2 November attacks against Turkish civilian targets, which Turkey attributes to the PKK operating out of Syria. Turkey-U.S. coordination on Syria is also not as high-leveled as in the past, and given Washington's emphasis on pivoting away from the Middle East, Turks want to know what will happen to the PKK statelet on their border. However, U.S. diplomacy can calm tensions. This has worked historically. U.S. officials could build on past Turkey-U.S. SDF arrangements to go to the negotiating table. In 2019, Turkey, Washington, and the SDF formally agreed to withdrawal of SDF forces with joint U.S.-Turkish military patrols to verify. To maintain peace in the region, Washington should revitalize these commitments. The SDF could withdraw from Syria and extend its pledge not to attack Turkey in return for a Turkish promise not to move against the northeast. The first impact is ISIS. Mandel 22 finds that another Turkish invasion on the horizon could overwhelm Kurdish forces, who now incarcerate more than 10,000 ISIS prisoners. ISIS terrorists are waiting for an opportunity to escape and restart their jihad. As a result, Michael 18 finds that failed states are the biggest generators of humanitarian crisis and refugees. They endanger regime stability in neighboring states and lay the ground for extremist groups. The second impact is Iran. Azizi 22 finds that Iran plans to respond militarily to Turkish incursion in Syria, which could spiral out of control. Iran has also worked on military plans to confront Turkish forces, including promotion of cooperation between Iran-backed militias in Syria and Kurdish militias. If Turkey decides to carry out its plan to attack northern Syria, Iran will respond via proxy forces. The situation could lead to long-term conflict. Avery 20 terminalizes that Pakistan, Russia, and China, firm allies of Iran, might be drawn into a general war in the Middle East. Nuclear weapons would be used by accident or miscalculation, making the world uninhabitable. Thus, please save the lives of millions and affirm.
We negate the resolution resolve. The United States federal government should increase diplomatic efforts to peacefully resolve internal armed conflicts in West Asia. Let's first define West Asia. It's a geographic region of Asia that includes Turkey, Iran, and other countries of the Middle East and the Arabian Peninsula. Now to define internal armed conflicts. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, the two major civil wars ongoing in West Asia are the Syrian Civil War and the Yemeni Civil War. Any other war talked about in this debate should not be spoken about, or it's a breach of topicality. The affirmation must prove the United States can resolve internal armed conflicts if this topic was affirmed, and the negation has the burden to prove why not. Contention 1. The U.S. has no credibility. According to Miller 20, American leadership and exceptionalism cannot fix a broken Middle East or play a major role in leading it to a better future. It's no one's region, and no single power inside or outside the region can dominate it. The U.S. is no longer the top dog in the Middle East neighborhood, and it doesn't need to be. Subpoint A. Yemen. Diplomacy has already failed in Yemen. Nagy and Young 22 state, the United Nations brokered truce in Yemen that held for 6 months, having been extended twice, collapsed when the two main warring sides, the Houthis and the Yemenite government, restarted the war. During the truce, the Houthis regrouped, recruited more fighters, and reinforced positions on all front lines. They significantly enhanced their military preparedness and even held a series of military parades to demonstrate their increased power. Subpoint B, Syria. American intervention simply cannot fix Syria. According to Ashford 16, no form of U.S. intervention can fix Syria's fundamental problems, which are fragmentation, internecine fighting, and an utter lack of any unified anti-Assad coalition. This focus on diplomacy, backed by humanitarian efforts, may also have a low probability of ending the Syrian civil war. Our impact is that U.S. intervention through sanctions worsens the food crisis. According to Al Jazeera 20, Syria could face severe bread shortages for the first time since the start of the war, with an economic meltdown and fresh United States sanctions. In the past 6 months alone, the number of food insecure people in Syria is estimated to risen from 7.9 million to 9.3 million. Contention 2. U.S. diplomacy breeds war. According to Zimmerman 21, Biden has effectively ceded Yemen to the Islamic Republic, threatening not only Yemen's neighbor, but U.S. allies in the Middle East, and ultimately the United States itself. According to Carlin 20, when civil war negotiations occurs frequently, they serve other strategic purposes. For example, warring parties often use negotiations instrumentally to rearm and reorganize, and the initiation of talks legitimizes the rebel group. Talks also increase the likelihood of a rebel group fragmentation, foster temporary reductions in violence, and constitute an important transformation in the form of confrontation. This has already happened in U.S. negotiations in Yemen. According to Al-Musawa 23, the Biden administration diplomacy is ongoing, but it's clear it's not going anywhere. Making a resurgence of violence now seems inevitable. There has been no diplomatic progress whatsoever. There has been no political process, no negotiations, or even a prospect of them, so an all-out war can resume at any time. Our impact is U.S. war crimes. According to Magni 23, the report from Oxfam Charity found that the Saudi-led coalition used weapons supplied solely by the UK and the US. They analyzed attacks on the civilians in the Yemen's war during the 14th-month period, using weapons supplied by the UK and the US, being responsible for a quarter of the attacks. Purcell 20 states, Human Rights Watch warned that the U.S. might be liable for laws of war violations in Yemen. The Armed Conflict and Event Data Project estimates that 112,000 people have died from the hostilities, including 12,000 civilians. Millions more suffer from this. If the United States are trying to peacefully end this concept, they will not be supporting it and only contributing to its death and suffering. So, Judge, we urge you to vote a negation ballot. Thank you. Right, I'll start on your first question.
All right.
You can go.
Isn't U.S. diplomacy good because Yemen ceasefire extended because of it?
No, the ceasefire was because of Ramadan. So it wasn't actually any negotiation that happened. Also,
Right, but the ceasefire has been extended to last.
Yeah,
So-
the ceasefire only led to the Houthis regrouping and rearming themselves. So the reason it was extended was not for any negotiation purpose. Yeah. All right, can I ask a question now?
Yeah.
Why exactly has the war between Turkey and Syria not started yet?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Why exactly has the war between Turkey and Syria not started yet?
Well, what we would say is this is because it has actually started already.
Can you elaborate?
So it has started already because Turkey is invading.
Okay. You can have the next question.
Okay. So, can you elaborate on how Biden has ceded Yemen to?
Because currently the Yemeni war is basically one-sided at this point. So at this point, we've already lost.
Okay. All right.
Do you have any examples of the U.S. diplomacy actually working?
Yes, we do. So, for example, the Camp David Accords between Israel and Palestine. The effects of that peace treaty still last to this day.
Mhm.
And there are many other examples we can provide you with evidence. How does the U.S. intervention through sanctions worsen the food crisis?
Because the sanctions are what's hurting Syria's economy, which is what's leading to the food crisis. The U.S. is the one putting sanctions on Syria.
Okay.
Okay. Do
You
you
have a
have
question?
it? Huh? Yeah. Thanks. Do you have any quantitative impacts?
Yes, we do. We have an impact on nuclear war, and yeah, we have an impact on nuclear war, and we have other impacts.
Wait, is there
Uh,
any numbers in that?
what do you mean numbers?
Like, do you have just
Evidence?
for weighing purposes? Oh, okay.
Oh, do you mean evidence?
No, not evidence. Just like how many people would die, like a number. But that's fine. We don't need numbers for.
Okay.
Yeah, next question.
Okay. I don't have any more questions. Do you?
Cross is almost over, so we can just end.
Is everybody ready? We observe that America will always remain involved in West Asia. The only thing that's unique now, the choice isn't between American diplomacy or disengagement, but rather diplomacy or violent force. Do we want to solve issues by peace or violent force? That's simply the question right now. It's time to try diplomacy to fill a void that has often been filled by military power. We must learn from our mistakes, as deaths from Western interventions could be as high as 8 million in the past. They could be even higher now. On their case, first on topicality, their definition is wrong. The correct definition for internal armed conflict is not domestic armed conflict. Both are inherently different. We'd give you the International Red Cross 22 that finds that a non-international armed conflict refers to a situation of violence involving protracted armed confrontations between government forces and one or more armed groups. This doesn't mean that these armed groups cannot be other nations. That's not what the card says. Or it could be between these groups themselves, like a civil war, but it could be almost anything. On Yemen. First, we tell you that Al-Hajj 22 explains that the fresh round of violence comes amid heightened tensions following last week's failure to extend a ceasefire between the warring sides, and this failure to extend a nationwide truce last Sunday has threatened to reignite the bloody civil war after 6 months secession in frontline fighting. However, what we'd say is that now it's good because Yemen has been in the ceasefire for the past 5 months, but just recently, just a few days ago, they've extended the ceasefire. It's not because of Ramadan. They've extended it past Ramadan. Don't consider any of their links. But done. We'd give you Robinson 22 that finds that there's no long-term solution in the status quo. Peace efforts gained momentum in April, and the Houthis and the coalition forces coordinated their first nationwide ceasefire in years, but after 6 months of relative peace, failed to renew again, but now they are. That's because we've used the only type of diplomacy we've really ever used in the region. Done. On their second subpoint, they say that Syria's crisis can't be fixed. What we say is that Syria might not be able to be fixed, but current Iranian protests can. We shouldn't get stuck in the past. We should look towards the future. This brings a chilling comparison to the Syrian civil war. Remember that just like how Assad kidnapped the 13-year-old al-Khatib 11 years ago, now Iran has murdered Masa Amini. Time is running out to prevent Syria 2.0. History must not repeat itself, as a decade of war in Syria has left nearly 500,000 people dead. Furthermore, every 20 theorizes that Pakistan, Russia, and China, firm allies of Iran, might be drawn into a general war in the Middle East, destabilizing the region. This is the largest impact in this round. On U.S. war. Turn this. Affirming decreases in 2 ways. First is shifting focus on helping domestic instability reorient American priorities. Woodward 22 writes that our U.S. approach to the Middle East is defined by restraint, forging an alternative path that embraces anti-imperialism should work towards a path that seeks security within states based off of common security. Second is hard power trade-off. We'd give you K21 that writes, under this strategy, the U.S. would shift from a reliance on military tools to an approach that prioritizes diplomacy. And second, we'd say that even if the U.S. is bad, China is worse. The first is fending innocence. Lin 13 finds that this will not be the first time China has claimed neutrality while covertly helping dictator with states arms manufacturing. China's strategy to acquire energy assets abroad has driven China to have a more interventionist stance in the Middle East. And second, Chinese imperialism is growing even worse now. China's fill-in and BRI attempts will give it a stranglehold on the region, allowing them to expand their political and economic chokeholds on these countries. China is even more imperialist than the U.S. The difference is that at least the U.S. makes good faith attempts to try to promote democracy, whereas China does nothing. They just have bad impacts here and there. At the end of the day, the world they are proposing is a world where China takes over the Middle East, and therefore we negate.
Time will start. Now, a quick observation about this topic. This topic speaks about resolving current internal armed conflicts within West Asia. We give you the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute card in 2020, where they say the major internal armed conflicts is in Syria and Yemen. Judge, you cannot let my opponent's arguments, which are mostly talking about future wars. My opponent's entire Iran argument is built on we should be stopping future wars. The topic quite literally says to peacefully resolve internal armed conflicts in West Asia. That is not to prevent future armed conflict. It is about talking about the status quo. We must evaluate the status quo. We should not be evaluating futuristic arguments. Now let's go to my side of the flow. Judge, my opponents completely dropped their point on Syria. They say they quite literally said Syria cannot be fixed, but Iran can though. Judge, this is a clear drop. So you should be extending that. You should also be extending our impact of 2.2 million lives being pushed through United States sanctions. Judge, this is a clear drop here. Now let's go to our point on Yemen. My opponents argued that the Yemen is falling. Troops had a ceasefire for over 6 months. But Judge, we already showed you with Nagy and Young 22, which directly writes the last time we had a truce in Yemen that held for 6 months. The only reason the Houthis strategically did this is so they could regroup, recruit more fighters, and reinforce the positions on all front lines. They used this troop as a strategic marketplace to quite literally help take over more and kill more people. Judge, Yemen is a failed state. We cannot save this country, Judge. You have to evaluate Yemen and Syria in this debate. We cannot be talking about my opponent's futuristic arguments. Now let's go into the point I'm saying that there is no long-term solution in the status quo. But that is a theory argument. The negation does not have to solve. There is no theory in this. There's no theory in this tournament. So we cannot be arguing that the negation has to vote for has to support the status quo. The negation simply has to prove that we should not be increasing our diplomatic efforts. Now let's go onto our second contention. Judge, this is a completely dropped contention. They argue that the United States helps in helping resolve domestic conflicts and pretty much helps promote democracy, but they completely dropped their entire. They did not respond to anything from all of us at 23 calls. They quite literally said that from the United Nations Special Envoy that there's been no diplomatic process whatsoever. There's been no political process, no negotiations, or even a prospect of that. So even then, an all-out war can resume at any time. And even then, they did not respond to our impact on U.S. war crimes. The report by the Oxfam charity found that the Saudi-led coalition used weapons supplied solely by the UK and the United States. They analyzed attacks on civilians in Yemen's war during a 14-month period, and they specifically used these weapons. And not to mention that this led to the death of 112,000 people, Judge. How are we helping solve domestic conflicts when we're actively aiding in this war? And I'll go to their side of the flow. Judge, under subpoint A, they talk about cyber gain. This argument is completely non-topical because we can go back to my observation. We have to be resolving current internal armed conflicts. Judge, we can just not evaluate this contention because there's no current war here. Then we can go to the subpoint B. My opponents fail to realize the United States supports protests against Iran's government. And even if you look at their own case of evidence, it does not speak about the United States solving. They don't even speak about solving the case. You can just simply look at their case. It doesn't talk about the United States. They don't have any evidence that the United States can solve this. They just say that the United States should solve this. And on to the last point on Turkey. The thing is, the Turkey market is not an internal armed conflict because they're talking about international peace research is true, right? The Turkey is a low intentional extra-state subnational armed conflict. That is not an internal armed conflict. They said quite literally themselves, they're invading Syria. That is an international war, Judge. So that's a clear win on our side. Now let's go into some some definitions debate. Judge, you should take our definition over them because they say domestic armed conflicts aren't the same thing. But Judge, if you literally just Google this card, it will say internal armed conflicts and domestic armed conflicts are the same thing, Judge. They just have a different first word. Internal means within. Domestic means within. They quite literally, the words mean the same thing. You should take our evidence over there because we cite a Cornell international law paper which writes that if you go to an international court, you would use internal armed conflicts or domestic armed conflicts in the same way. Now we can go into impact calculus. Judge, they have a complete drop on our Syria point, which means we can extend it because Weiner and Sharp 10 writes, that's not hard. Even then, sanctions are a key part of a diplomacy. So increasing diplomacy means increasing sanctions means more people starving to death. So for all of these reasons, you should be voting the engagement side. Thank you. Shall we start Crossfire?
Okay, great. Yeah, we can start Cross. May I have the first question?
Yes.
Could you elaborate on how internal and domestic are different? Because last time I checked, domestic means inside a country, and internal, well, the topic is talking about internal in West Asia. So wouldn't that just mean it's inside West Asia?
No.
Okay, could you
because the phrase internal armed conflicts within West Asia, that means there has to be internal armed conflicts within the borders of West Asia. That
yes,
You know,
Yeah, so that means that there are armed conflicts inside
No,
West Asia.
no, 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 no. We were
what-
framing the debate. Okay, if the topic were to mean that is wars within West Asia, it would say armed conflicts
Mhm.
within West Asia. It says internal armed conflicts, which is a specific term used by war studies.
But internal armed conflicts means internal. So we can agree that a war conflict is basically a war, right? So then basically internal would be internally
No.
inside West Asia, a war
No.
inside West Asia, right?
This is not true. The topic quite literally says resolve internal armed conflicts within West Asia. Internal armed
Inside
conflict
West
is
Asia. Yeah.
a term used by war studies, which defines different types of wars. Internal
Okay.
armed conflict. So can I have a question? We're getting to this thing going.
Sure, but could you send your evidence after cross?
I already sent you.
Okay. Okay, great. You can
Okay.
have a question.
Is Turkey and Syria an international war?
That would not be an international war. I'd say that yes, it might be an international war, but still Syria and Turkey are both in West Asia, and we give you our definition, which means that internal armed conflicts means a war inside West Asia, and Turkey and Syria are in West
Your
Asia.
evidence just says what an internal armed conflict is. It doesn't say what an internal armed conflict within West Asia is.
Well,
If-
we can give you the definition of an internal armed conflict, which is basically a armed confrontation between government forces and one or more organized armed groups. It doesn't tell you that these armed groups couldn't be other states. And furthermore, you try to tell the judge here that internal armed conflicts in West Asia are not the same as internal armed conflicts. I'd say they're the
No,
same,
you're-
but it's just restricted to West Asia.
No, you're just not looking at the topic correctly. The thing is, we should be looking at the topic as there's a certain type of war, and the United States should peacefully resolve that, yes or no.
Yeah, the United States, the topic is resolved. The United States should peacefully involve its government, basically, to peacefully negotiate in armed conflicts in West Asia. It's basically
Which are specifically a specific type of conflict, which are pretty much civil wars, and these civil wars
they're not civil wars,
Yes,
though.
that is the definition of a resolve. Like literally, this is what they use in
That's
international
not
law.
the definition. We'd give you our card that says that literally these armed groups could be anything. That's not
It's
responding.
international law.
Well, even though it is international law, we'd say that it'd be the same thing, but just be restricted in West Asia this
Yeah,
time.
the topic is restricted within West Asia, but the
Yes, the topic is restricted in West Asia, and that's why it'd be the same as international law, but now the subject would just be West Asia, and I believe that's cross.
Time starts. Now, first, let's talk about what they say about our case. They say that our definition is wrong. The correct definition for internal armed conflict, notice internal, not domestic armed conflict. Both are inherently different. We give you the International Red Cross that states a non-international armed conflict refers to a situation of violence involving protracted armed confrontations between government forces and one or more organized armed groups. This does include states. And even if you don't concede our evidence, their own evidence doesn't even agree what they're saying, because later in the Cornell evidence, I quote, they do include armed conflicts that take place in the territory of a state where there is protracted armed conflict between government authorities and organized armed groups or between such groups. It never says anything about a civil war. Furthermore, they literally dropped our framework. We win on that point. On Cyprus, they try to tell you that our argument is non-topical. This is in fact topical because it is a conflict between the Greek and Turkish communities living in Cyprus, not the governments themselves. The governments are just going to be dragged in. And even if the war itself isn't topical, the nation where the tensions are brewing is topical. And Nations Online finds that the influence of Greece and Cyprus is undeniable. It is obviously a huge force in the region. Next on Turkey, in the status quo, Turkey is on the offensive, threatening the PKK through threats of a full-blown ground offensive into Syria. This is because the United States is shifting attention away from the Middle East, which has raised tensions and threatening all-out war. U.S. diplomacy is key. However, without astute diplomacy, the impact is cataclysmic. Currently, the PKK holds nearly 10,000 ISIS prisoners hostage. However, if conflict occurs, these prisoners will break free and start potentially another 9/11 attack. Furthermore, Iran is going to get involved. Allies such as China and Russia should start a nuclear confrontation. They dropped this argument. It's the most important in the round. On their case, first on Yemen, we'll go for the turn. Yemen has been in a ceasefire for the past 5 months, and it just recently extended the ceasefire. It's not because of Ramadan. It's a ceasefire now, even though it's not Ramadan anymore. Then they say that on Syria, Then they say on Syria that Syria can't be solved. We agree that Syria can't be solved, but Iran can be solved. Crossfire replied to our C2 current Iranian protests will erupt in a civil war unless America uses diplomacy. This brings a chilling comparison to the Syrian civil war. Remember how just like how Assad kidnapped al-Khatib 11 years ago, now Iran has murdered Masa Amini. Time is running out to prevent Syria 2.0. History must not repeat itself, as a decade of war in Syria has left nearly 500,000 people dead. Furthermore, Avery 20 theorizes that Pakistan, Russia, and China, firm allies of Iran, might also be drawn into a general war in the Middle East, destabilizing the region. This is dropped. They just say that we use theory. We don't. We are just pointing out the facts. At the end of the day, our C3 on Turkey goes on response to. It's the largest impact of the round. Don't let them respond to it in final focus.
So as a brief off-time roadmap, again, I'll be going over some of the definitions in this debate. I'll be going over our side of the flow, my opponent's side of the flow, and if time permits, I'll be weighing. Okay, so my time starts now. First of all, Judge, domestic and internal mean the same thing. Domestic means within, internal means within. We are citing actual war studies and international war terms. Are you going to take the speculation of two middle schoolers or the actual term people use to refer to these things? The person who wrote this topic meant to say United States to solve a specific conflict. Even if their definition is true, a conflict between a state actor and an armed group is quite literally the definition of a civil war. They're misconstruing their evidence. Do not let them do this. Now on to our case. Judge, diplomacy is failing time and time again, which is reducing U.S. credibility. For our offense, we are collapsing on Syria, but we'll still respond to our opponent's points on our second contention. But just so you know, our opponents are wrong. Yemen is currently not in a ceasefire. Again, Syria. Judge, our opponents tell you to simply ignore Syria. But it is U.S. sanctions that are causing Syria to suffer. 9.3 million people in Syria are food insecure. Syria cannot be solved by U.S. interference. It's too fragmented, too broken, and there's no anti-Assad coalition. U.S. diplomacy would completely fail here. Now, on to our second contention. U.S. diplomacy has only bred war. Diplomatic progress is going nowhere, as we've shown in Yemen. And even worse, the U.S. is supplying the war. According to Purcell 20, the Human Rights Watch warned that the U.S. might be liable for law of war violations in Yemen. The Armed Conflict and Event Data Project estimated that 112,000 people have died from hostilities, including 12,000 civilians. Millions more suffer. Now, onto my opponent's side of the case. First of all, Judge, my opponent's entire case is speculation. All of their impacts are futuristic. They give you no evidence how the U.S. diplomacy has worked, why it would work. They just tell you U.S. diplomacy should work. So, Judge, already you could completely de-evaluate their entire case. But for the sake of argumentation, let's go down. Also, diplomacy is the opposite of military force. First of all, our opponents say the situation in West Asia would worse without U.S. interference. But turn this, because U.S. is making the situation worse. We showed you how U.S. is funding Saudi Arabia's war crimes, leading to deaths of 112,000 people, including 12,000 civilians. Then Iran. We did not drop this argument, but Iran is our enemy, and also it's not internal armed conflict. Finally, they don't say why U.S. diplomacy will work here, just why it should. Also, they ignore our cards saying that Turkey and Syria are an international conflict, thus it should not be evaluated in this debate if you take our definition, which is the definition that is used in international war studies. So, Judge, now let's move on to weighing. Our opponents give you no quantitative impacts, while we show you numbers. All of their impacts are futuristic. For some of the conflicts that haven't even happened, or conflicts that shouldn't be weighed in this debate because they are not internal armed conflicts. We show you how 9.3 million people are food insecure thanks to U.S. sanctions being put on them in Syria. Or that 112,000 people were killed from U.S.-funded weapons in the Civil War. Judge, this is showing a clear link between what has happened in the past and what will happen in the future if U.S. increases its diplomatic forces. So, Judge, we urge you to vote a negation ballot. Thank you.
Cool. Let's start Grand Cross.
Yes.
Would you guys
We can start Grand Cross if you guys like.
Yeah. I'll start.
Okay,
right
time. Yep.
You could study your first question.
Great. So let's look at your summary, right? So you say that domestic still means the same as internal. But your own card literally says that internal could mean, like, your own card says differently.
Your
So,
own card supports our definition.
Okay,
yeah, it's literally the
definition. You're misconstruing your evidence.
Well,
the
I
definition-
don't think it's our evidence at this point. I think it's your evidence.
Well, okay,
Yeah.
let's just clarify one thing in this debate. We have the same definition of internal armed conflict. We just have different views on what the topic means.
So we can agree that the definition is the same, right?
Well, not exactly.
No.
We both have we have refuting evidence. We have
We're using the same
Evidence.
evidence, but we're seeing it in different ways.
Okay.
So we believe armed groups means just an armed group, while you believe armed group is something bigger.
Anyway,
Sure. Okay. Yeah, you guys can have a question.
is Turkey not an international conflict? Because within both of our definitions, there are two states within Turkey and Syria.
Okay. So what we would say is that because both Turkey and Syria are in West Asia now, then an internal armed conflict in West Asia would be an armed conflict in West Asia, and Turkey and Syria are both in West Asia. So obviously it will be taught.
For your own definition, so you're just not using your own.
Your own definition
That
says
is our
Turkey and Syria are not internal armed conflict. There is
That's not what our evidence says.
Okay, this is what your evidence is. It defines what an internal armed conflict is, and then the topic states that we should peacefully resolve these conflicts. You say
an internal armed conflict is literally just a conflict inside West Asia that's involving the military.
No, okay.
And Turkey and Syria is the obvious.
Turkey and Syria already have their own classification, so they can't be an internal armed conflict. That's like saying
why can't they be an internal armed conflict if they're literally part of West Asia? Internal means inside. West Asia means West Asia. It literally just means a military conflict in West Asia, right?
It's because internal armed conflict is a term. It's
Yes.
a term to state a specific type of war.
It's a definition.
Not a
Because
blanket term.
Yes, it's a definition.
As a blanket term.
internal means internal, and West Asia means West Asia. Those are literally the
No,
definitions.
Turkey and Syria are. Oh my god. Okay. Turkey and Syria already have their own classification. It's like saying a cat.
What do
is
you
a
mean
mammal.
by cat classification? Well, even if so let's say the cat was a mammal, right? The cat would still be a cat.
What?
That doesn't make any sense.
What?
Then what is your?
Okay.
Let me show
They
you.
all have their own classification. They can't be two things at once. They're not an internal armed conflict if they're already a subnational armed conflict. And we
They
have
can't be
evidence
both
that
because
they're
internal means
conflict.
inside. Internal means inside, and West Asia is West Asia. It just means that the conflict is happening inside West Asia and it's involving the military. That's literally what our evidence says. Okay, I think that's crossed. Okay, if you guys are all ready, I'll start time in 3, 2, 1. They say that our definition is wrong. However, the correct definition for internal armed conflict is not domestic armed conflict. Both are inherently different. We tell you that domestic means inside a country. However, internal means inside a region. It's simply not the same definition. It's not our definition as well. We give you that this is the definition of the International Red Cross. But done. They literally dropped our framework. The choice is between violent forces and diplomacy, not diplomacy or disengagement. On our case, we'll collapse on Turkey. In the status quo, Turkey is on the offensive, threatening the PKK through threats of a full-blown offensive in Syria. And this is why the U.S. is shifting attention from the Middle East right now, which has raised tensions and is threatening all-out war. And however, U.S. diplomacy is key because without the astute diplomacy, the impact would be cataclysmic. Currently, the PKK holds nearly 10,000 ISIS prisoners hostage. However, if conflict occurs, these prisoners will break free and start potentially another 9/11 attack. This isn't responded to at all. It's a clean drop. Furthermore, Iran is going to get involved. Allies such as China and Russia would start nuclear confrontation. This is not responded to as well. They completely dropped this argument. It's the most important in the round. Even if they win everything else, we still win the round. And even though this round is already over on their case, they said that Yemen is not in a ceasefire. Our evidence from literally yesterday says that they are. Our evidence is more recent. They collapsed on Syria. They say that America's influence in Syria is terrible. No, it's not. We give you historical examples about how American influence is good. And that's why Best Citizenships 20 finds that the U.S. is one of the highest diplomatic nations, both in effectiveness and missions. And according to the BBC 07, in 1973, a huge breakdown between Middle Eastern nations happened through the Camp David Accords. Thanks to U.S. diplomacy alone, we say that Syria can't be solved, but Iran can. Cross-apply our C2. That means that Iran can be solved, Syria can. At the end of the day, our C3 on Turkey goes clean conceded to, it's unresponded to, and it's the largest impact of round. It's a very, very, very clean F ballot. Thank you.
Time will start. Now, frankly, the biggest issue of this debate is what the topic quite literally means. Judge, both sides give you a definition of internal armed conflicts. That is fine. We have quite literally similar definitions. But the only problem that is within this debate is my opponents are just misconstruing what the topic says. The topic says is about a specific type of conflict within the borders of West Asia. Judge, we can just go on to the point that they collapsed on Final Focus. They collapsed on Iran and on Turkey. But Judge, we already give you an unresponded card to, which we've extended through every speech. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute writes that Turkey is a low-intensity exercise subnational armed conflict. Why would you trust my opponents? Why should you trust my middle school opponents while you should be trusting an internationally reputable authors from an actual institute, Judge. Judge, my opponent's point, sorry, now let's go into our side of the flow. Judge, we have so much more offense at this point. My opponents argue Iran, but in their own case, they don't have any evidence saying that the United States would help Iran. They don't even respond to my points in rebuttal stating that this topic speaks about current conflicts. Now let's go into an actual current conflict. Syria. Judge, the only response they've had in this debate about Syria is that Syria is, we can solve Iran and we should not let another Syria happen. That means they've completely dropped our point on sanctions. They've just never responded to our points saying that because of the United States sanctions, Al Jazeera 20 writes that in the past 6 months alone, the number of food insecure people in Syria is estimated to have risen from 7.9 million to 9.3 million, Judge. We actually have impacts that directly correlate to the topic and diplomatic efforts. All of their impacts are completely speculation. They argued that terrorist attacks would happen again, but they just completely dropped that point and then they brought it up back in final focus. And even then they break up that there's going to be a nuclear war. But Judge, nuclear war doesn't happen. That's just a simple fact. The probability of our impacts happening, you can look this down at impact calculus, Judge. You should be looking at our impact. If you increase diplomatic efforts, you will be increasing sanctions. That already has a direct link to poverty and suffering. Well, my opponents have a completely non-probable impact because nuclear war will never happen. So, Judge, for all these reasons, you should go on the more probable side than negation. Thank you.